Apple's new chips are here. M3, M3 Pro and M3 Max are supposed to defend Apple's performance crown against increasingly strong competition. In this video, we'll go on a deep dive straight into the silicon heart of Apple's new M3 chips to figure out what has actually changed versus the previous M2 generation and uncover any hidden secrets inside the silicon. Without spoiling anything, there are some huge changes, but not all of them are positive. This is gonna be a very in-depth video. We'll start with a silicon analysis for all three new chips, followed by a more detailed look at some of the changes to CPU, GPU and NPU. I've marked each individual chapter in the timeline below for easy access. Let's start with the smallest one, the M3. What might look like a silicon jungle at first is actually a very sophisticated SoC design. The P-core CPU cluster is located to the center left of the chip, including 4 individual performance cores, a dedicated shared cache, and an attached advanced matrix extension unit, AMAX for short. The P-core cluster layout is asymmetrical. The 2 cores above the cache are located more to the left than those below. This is most likely in order to maximize chip density and accommodate nearby structures, such as the AMAX unit. Below the P-cores and located right on the edge of the chip is the neural processing unit, Apple's AI engine. It's still a 16-core engine, even though it looks like it has only 8 clusters, something we'll touch on later in the video. If we stay on the edge of the chip, we can also locate 2 Thunderbolt ports, additional I/O and 2 display engines. Of course, the memory interface is also located on the edges of the chip. Apple is again using low-power DDR5 6400 and not low-power DDR5X. M3 has a total of 8 16-bit controllers for a combined 128-bit memory interface. The efficiency cores are almost right in the center of the chip. The 4 individual E-cores are clustered around a small shared cache and also have their own dedicated AMAX unit. Something that's very striking to me is how large the size difference between performance and efficiency cores actually is. There are huge architectural differences between Apple's P and E cores, which results in vastly different performance, efficiency and core sizes. A single P core is almost as big as all 4 E cores combined. A very different approach compared to AMD's Zen 4C, for example, which we discussed in a previous video. Next is the system level cache, or SLC, which acts as a kind of system-wide L3 cache. Because Apple is using a completely new 3nm process node, it's difficult to tell if the SLC cache size has changed or not. I'd say it's most likely of a similar size as in M1 and M2. And last but certainly not least, the 10-core GPU is located right above the SLC. All 10 individual cores are clearly visible. The GPU is the largest function unit of the entire chip, taking up around 23% of the die area. Now that we have located all the important parts of the M3 chip, the overall layout is visible. There are still a lot of unmarked areas left, which contain functions like media engines, system management units, control logic, test logic, and so on. It's almost impossible to accurately label these areas without help from an Apple engineer. If we compare the M3 to previous generations and just look at the raw specs, nothing seems to have changed. The M3 still has the same amount of CPU cores with 4 performance and 4 efficiency, the same amount of GPU cores, and the same 128-bit memory interface. But the transistor count tells a very different story. M2 already increased transistors by 25% versus the M1, going from 16 billion to 20 billion. And now M3 increases it again by another 25% to a whopping 25 billion transistors. That's most likely more than an Intel 14900K. M3 has 9 billion transistors more than the original M1. That's a 56% increase in just 2 generations. And while M2 might explain some of the new transistors with the addition of 2 GPU cores and the implementation of a new memory interface, M3 is seemingly eating up transistors without increasing raw specs. Of course, that's not actually the case, and we'll take a detailed look at the reasons for this later in the video to explain where all these additional transistors are going. Next is the M3 Pro, and if we look at the raw specs, we can see a pretty strange picture because there's a very obvious regression. The M3 Pro might still have a 12-core CPU, but instead of 8 performance and 4 efficiency cores like the M2 Pro, it's now a combination of 6 P and 6 E cores. The M3 Pro has less P cores than even the M1 Pro. The GPU also got a slight downgrade, if only by 1 core. Instead of 19 as on the M2 Pro, the M3 Pro now has 18 cores. To top it off, the M3 Pro also comes with a 25% smaller 192-bit memory interface, resulting in 25% less memory bandwidth. A very clear downgrade in all areas, which is confirmed by the fact that M3 Pro also has less transistors, 37 billion instead of 40 billion as on the M2 Pro. Something's going on. Let's try to confirm the official specs by analyzing the silicon. The P-core cluster is located a bit off-center with 6 individual cores visible, 2 above and 4 below the P-core exclusive cache. It's a true 6-core design, not 8 cores with 2 cores disabled. The E-core cluster is tucked right in between the P-cores and the edge of the chip, and again we can see a native 6-core design, with all 6 cores located in close proximity to the E-core exclusive cache and another AMAX unit. Right below the E-cores and to the right of the P-cores, we can find the NPU, which looks almost identical to the NPU on the M3, although in a different orientation. There are 4 display engines to the left of the P-cores, and if we take a tour around the edges of the chip, we can locate 4 Thunderbolt ports, additional I/O, and an interestingly designed memory interface, which is split up into 3 areas. The M3 has 12 16-bit SerDes for a combined 192-bit interface. The SLC is located slightly above the center of the chip and surrounded by the 18-core GPU. Again, no cores are deactivated on the full chip. On the M3 Pro, the GPU takes up an even larger area of the chip with around 28%. It's clearly the main focus if we look at silicon area. With all important parts located, the final layout is visible. It's a high-density design, not unlike the M3, and very different to the layout of the M3 Max, which we will take a look at next. The M3 Max is a true monster of a chip. Just looking at a transistor count of 92 billion makes me a bit dizzy. Nvidia's 8102, which powers the RTX 4090, almost looks tiny in comparison at only 76 billion transistors. This many transistors on a monolithic chip is only possible due to the new 3nm node, as it would most likely break the reticle limit on 5nm. And the extra cores definitely don't explain all the additional transistors. M3 Max has a 50% increase in P cores over the M2 Max. It has 2 more GPU cores and the same 512-bit memory interface. Looking at the die shot, the M3 Max has a almost clean layout. The P cores are located in the center top of the chip, 8 cores above and 4 cores below the large shared cache, next to dual AMAX units. The E cores are located a bit to the left, and with only 4 cores, a tiny cache and a single AMAX unit, they pale in comparison to the P cores. It's interesting to note that both the M3 and M3 Max have only 4 E cores, while the M3 Pro has 6. Further to the left, at the edges of the chip, we can find the NPU, but this time it does look different to the NPUs on the M3 and M3 Pro. It's hard to tell if that's die shot related or if there's something else going on. In the top half of the chip, we can also find 4 Thunderbolt ports, a lot of extra I/O and 8 display engines. The bottom half of the M3 Max is almost entirely used up by the 40-core GPU, the huge SLC and the large 512-bit memory interface with 32 16-bit controllers. All 40 cores are visible, none are deactivated on the top-end version. Something that is missing from this die shot is the die-to-die interconnect that will be used to connect 2 M3 Max chips to create the M3 Ultra, but so far Apple has always removed this part from the picture they provide. Overall, the M3 Max has a very clear layout and a lot more so-called black silicon, which is seemingly unused area on the chip itself. With all parts labeled, it's clear that the M3 Max, like its predecessor, is basically a huge GPU, which takes up around 35% of the chip. With the entire M3 chip family side by side, the differences in size and layout are obvious. M3 and M3 Pro have a much more visually cluttered layout, very different to the M3 Max. And that's also the first point I want to talk about. Why is the M3 Pro, at least on paper, a downgrade versus the M2 Pro? I think there's a very specific reason, and that reason is product segmentation. Apple's previous chip families basically only consisted of 2 chips. Yes, I know there are the M2, M2 Pro, M2 Max, and even the M2 Ultra. But if we take a closer look, only the M2 and the M2 Max are actually their own unique design. The M2 Ultra is just 2 M2 Max, and the M2 Pro is a M2 Max with half the GPU, SLC and memory interface removed. The upper area of the M2 Max is identical to the M2 Pro, the same with the M1 Max and Pro. They not only have the same exact CPU configuration, they are based on the same silicon design. A smart move by Apple from an engineering point of view. Apple's silicon team only has to design 2 chips, the base M version and the Max version. All other chips are derived from those 2, maximizing engineering resources. But what's smart from a silicon point of view might not be smart when it comes to sales. If you don't need the huge GPU power of the Max, the Pro chips offer the same CPU performance at a much lower price. And let's be honest, the Pro chips already have a very powerful GPU. For most people buying into the M1 and M2 family, the only real question was if they should get the base M1 and M2 or the Pro. There was very little reason to upgrade to the Max, something Apple had to change. And that's what it did with the M3 Pro, which is now its own unique design. Which also means Apple had to design one extra chip this generation. That's additional work and doesn't come cheap. But the result is a more coherent lineup, where each chip is a clear upgrade over the previous one. It might not be great from a consumer point of view, but it's a move Apple had to make if they want to offer a product segmentation with clear and useful performance tiers. That's the reason the M3 Pro seems like a downgrade, because Apple adjusted its position in the lineup. The next thing I want to talk about is the huge increase in transistor count for the M3. Even though the specs haven't really changed. Where are all the extra transistors going? To figure that out, I went ahead and compared NPU, CPU and GPU across the different generations, with some really interesting results. Let's start with the NPU. By the way, if you're still watching, leave a comment down below. I'm always interested to see how many of you watch these long deep dives all the way through. If we extract the NPUs from each generation and compare them side by side, there are some interesting generational changes. Every NPU looks very different, even though they are all supposed to be 16-core NPUs. On M1 and M2 we can make out each of the 16 individual cores. On the M3 there are only 8 visible cores. It gets even stranger when we compare the NPU of the M3 and M3 Pro with the NPU of the M3 Max. They look very different, even though again we can only see 8 individual cores. I wonder what's going on here. If you have any ideas, let me know in the comments. Something that is obvious though is that Apple is optimizing the NPU not primarily for performance, but for space efficiency. Don't get me wrong, the NPU has seen a decent performance increase over the generations, from 11 TOPS in the M1, 15.8 TOPS in the M2 and now 18 TOPS in the M3. But the more interesting part is that the NPU has gotten progressively smaller, at least in relation to the entire chip. On M1 the NPU used about 6% of the total die area, with M2 it decreased to 4%, and on M3 the NPU is only using 3% of the chip. I wonder if we will see a change in this trend with M4 as neural processing and AI acceleration are increasingly more important. But the NPU clearly isn't eating a lot of extra transistors on the M3, so we have to continue looking. The CPU P cores are next in line. There's very little changes from M1 to M2, we can see a similar core layout. The M3 P core on the other hand does look different, but this is to be expected with a new process node and it's hard to say what actually changed just by looking at it. Something I found interesting is the fact that on all 3 generations, the P cores take up around 1.8 to 1.9% of the entire chip area, which means the P cores must have grown at a similar rate to the rest of the chip, about 25% more transistors every generation. Otherwise, they would take up less space over time. So we do know that a M3 P core must have a good amount of new transistors, contrary to our findings for the NPU, which actually got smaller. The same is true for the E cores, even though the resolution of Apple's die shots is a bit too low to make out anything more than an educated guess. My measurements show a steady 0.5% area usage across all generations, meaning the E cores also grew with the rest of the chip, adding more transistors over time. The M3 E core does look distinctly different, even though there's very little we can derive from that. Last but certainly not least, there's the GPU. Apple claims that they have redesigned the GPU from the ground up with the M3 generation. A claim that holds up at first visual comparison. M1 and M2 GPU cores are very similar, with the M2 core looking like it's a density optimized version of the M1 GPU, almost like someone squeezed it a bit. And it's not only visual. On M1 a GPU core took up around 2.1% of the chip area, which decreased to about 1.5% on the M2. Apple clearly succeeded in making the GPU cores more space efficient. The M3 GPU core looks vastly different, and it also reflects in the area usage. With M3, the GPU cores are again using around 2% of the chip area, which means they increased at a larger rate than the overall chip, otherwise they wouldn't have taken up more space. This increase in GPU core size also reflects on the entire GPU complex. On M2, 19% of the entire chip is used for the GPU. That increased to 24% for M2 Pro and 28% for M2 Max. M3 already starts at 23%, with M3 Pro at 28%, and M3 Max topping out at a whopping 35%. The GPU is without a doubt the number one reason for the increase in transistor count, as each core uses almost 50% more transistors compared to the previous M2 generation, and since the GPU already was the largest functional unit to begin with, increasing GPU transistor count has a massive effect on the whole chip. But Apple changed a lot more than just ray tracing and mesh shaders. If I understand the developer's guide correctly, Apple achieved nothing less than a graphics revolution. The first major change is that instead of individual registers, tile memory, and L1 cache, all data types are now using the same shared memory, which can be dynamically allocated. This has a couple of advantages. First, you don't need to pre-allocate all the data at a point when you don't even know if you will need it, reducing overhead. Second, if you do need more cache for a certain type of data, you can just allocate more and you are not limited to a preset amount of registers. This has huge implications for multi-threading and greatly increases thread occupancy. Basically, there's a lot less downtime within the ALUs, something TPUs have struggled with forever. Nvidia has started to implement similar systems but haven't included registers yet. In addition, Apple's new GPU cores can execute FP16, FP32 and int operations in parallel. I'm not a GPU engineer and most of this is far beyond my understanding of GPUs, but it's very obvious that the Apple Family 9 GPU generation is a major departure from previous GPU architectures. Hardware ray tracing and mesh shaders are nice, basically adding DirectX 12 feature level 2 to the hardware. But the real revolution is the dynamic shared cache system. This could turn out to be a true game changer. And with that, we have the main culprit responsible for the increase in transistor count on the M3, even though on paper the specs didn't change. Each GPU core uses a lot more transistors than before. It's the same reason why the M3 Pro GPU area increased, even though it has one less core than the M2 Pro, and why M3 Max has exploded to over 90 billion transistors. Okay, let's talk about the elephant in the room. The new 3nm node. Apple is using TSMC's latest N3B process node. The M3 chips are the first 3nm products on the market aside from the A17 Pro. As you can see in this slide, TSMC always releases an entire family of process nodes based on each new full step node. N7 was a new full node and N6 for example is also part of the same 7nm family. N5 was the next node step and also includes the N4 branded node, which despite their names are enhanced 5nm designs. The great part about this strategy is that nodes within the same family are design compatible, meaning you can port a chip that was designed on N7 to N6 without much effort and reap the benefits of an improved production process with higher density, better electrical efficiency, better yield, and so on. And this was the plan for N3 too. N3 was really ambitious with high transistor density and great efficiency, but TSMC's ambitions might have been a bit too high because N3 turned out to be difficult to manufacture, requiring a high amount of up to 25 EUV layers, which increases costs and results in lower than expected yields. But unlike Intel, who tried to fix their 10nm process for almost half a decade, TSMC reacted. The solution was an entirely new 3nm node called N3E, with a slightly more relaxed design rule. N3E isn't as dense as the original N3, but offers similar power and performance gains. Instead of over 25 EUV layers with double patterning, N3E just needs 19, reducing production cost and increasing yield. But there are two big caveats. One, first N3E products are only expected to release in second half of 2024. And two, it's not design compatible to the original N3, which now has been renamed to N3B. Basically, if you have an existing N3B design, which is what Apple uses for the A17 Pro and the M3 chip family, you can't just port it over to N3E. This doesn't have to be a bad thing. N3B, while more expensive to produce, is a very capable process node, and in many areas even superior to N3E. We have to see how first N3E products perform once they get released in a year or so. AMD's Zen 5C and NVIDIA's Blackwell could be the first entries. It's just important to know that Apple isn't using a bad process node, it's just a very expensive one. I wouldn't be surprised if Apple directly switched to N3P, skipping N3E, as it wouldn't really offer any tangible upgrades, but that's just me guessing. I knew it would be a long video, I didn't know it would be that long. If you made it that far, hats off to you. Apple's new M3 chips are clearly in a class of their own, combining the most advanced 3nm node available with some of the most sophisticated CPU and GPU architectures. If I had to make a list of the top 3 changes Apple introduced this generation, number 1 would be the completely overhauled GPU architecture. From what I can tell, Apple really hit a home run, and we haven't seen the true power of the new GPUs yet. It might take a while before software will take advantage of all the new features, but then the real performance difference will start to become apparent. Number 2 is the addition of a third unique chip to the lineup. Instead of being a cut-down design of the Max, the M3 Pro is more like a bigger M3. Maybe not what we wanted, but certainly the right move from a product segmentation perspective. All future Pro chips will be designed that way. Number 3 is the new 3nm process node, a industry first. And not only that, Apple is going all in right from the start, with a crazy 92 billion transistor chip in form of the M3 Max, which wouldn't have been possible in its monolithic form with any previous process nodes. I think these 3 changes not only define the M3 family, they will also have a lasting impact on Apple's future strategy. A lot of initial reviews were kinda disappointed. Do you feel the same? What do you think about the changes to the M3 Pro? And do you expect the new GPU to have a big advantage in the future? Let me know in the comments below. I hope you found this video interesting and see you in the next one.